In 1920, Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union, issued the statement, "Art belongs to the people." By this, Lenin meant that high artistic culture in Russia would no longer be accessible exclusively by the upper-class bourgeoisie, but would, under the Soviet system, be the province of the proletarian masses, as per Marxist doctrine. This principle became law under Andrei Zhdanov, director of Soviet cultural policy during the reign of the Stalin regime. Zhdanov not only mandated that art be produced for the people, but he also actively persecuted artists who did not comply with this principle. Here we'll explore two ways in which his principle was implemented. First, the establishment of socialist realism as the official artistic style of the Soviet Union in 1934, and second, the anti-formalist campaign of 1948, in which the regime persecuted some of the Union's premier musicians. Let's start with socialist realism. In August of 1934, writer Maxim Gorky convened the first Congress of Soviet Writers, comprised of the foremost stars of Soviet literature. Zhdanov attended the Congress as Stalin's personal delegate, and gave a speech emphasizing that socialist realism was the official style of the Soviet Union. The four basic components of socialist realism were laid out at the conference. Art must be proletarian, portraying issues and scenes relevant to and accessible by the working classes. Must portray scenes of the everyday life of the people, must be realistic in its presentation, and must support the aims of the state and the Communist Party, including ideological and class content. In employing these elements, Zhdanov declared, artists would depict reality in its revolutionary development, and in doing so, become engineers of the human soul. Socialist realism was to reflect and reinforce the ideals of the Revolution of 1917, including the primacy of the proletariat and proletarian interests over the bourgeoisie, and the inherent goodness of the party. It was not to be treated as intrinsically valuable, but as a means to serve a new cause, the cause of socialist construction. By making art accessible to the masses, artistic culture was no longer the province of the inaccessible and sophisticated tastes of the bourgeoisie, and was, like the economic means of production and distribution of wealth under the Soviet system, socialized. Following the Congress, socialist realism became the reigning method of artistic expression in the Soviet Union, and art forms that depicted erotic, religious, abstract, surrealist, and expressionist themes were considered bourgeois and forbidden. Let's take a look at some examples of socialist realism. Here we have a 1950 painting entitled Steelworkers. Now let's evaluate it based on the four components of socialist realism. The painting depicts laborers in a steel plant, a scene that would certainly be relatable not only to steelworkers, but also to industrial laborers of any kind. Indeed, this scene depicts the daily experience of these laborers, so that covers our second component. The painting is realistic in its depiction of the scene. Note the detail in the layout of the room, the lighting, the smoky conditions, and the tools and movements of the workers. These are objective, accurate representations. No elements of subjective, personal expression are to be found. Finally, the painting's depiction of the hard-working industrial laborer reflects not only Stalin's and the party's initiatives toward industrialization, but also the ideological glorification of hard work that benefited the state. Just as art itself served the cause of socialist construction, the activities depicted in art were activities that served the economic and social betterment of society. Thus, this is a typical work of socialist realism by all four criteria. Here is another 1950 painting, entitled In Peaceful Fields. Note again the realistically detailed depictions of the landscape and the field workers, the ideological glorification of the strong Soviet woman tilling the land, the relevance of the scene set in the agricultural sector which comprised a massive part of the Russian economy, and the reflection of the party's initiative for collectivized agriculture. This is another excellent example of socialist realism, art made for the people. The notion of art for the people was further implemented in the Zhdanov Doctrine of 1946, which formally established the dichotomy between Western bourgeois imperialism and Soviet proletarian democracy as distinct schools of thought. If any artistic expression was considered imperialist, it was counter-revolutionary and forbidden, and artists who did not comply with or promote party ideology would be persecuted. This policy extended not only to literature and visual art as we have discussed already, but also to music. In 1948, the Zhdanov Doctrine was implemented in the anti-formalist campaign against prominent Soviet composers such as Dmitry Shostakovich, Sergei Prokofiev, Aran Khachaturian, Vissarion Shabalin, Gavril Popov, and Nikolai Myaskovsky. These composers were condemned by the Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians because their works were formalistic, focused more on technical complexities and less on internal meaning, and many of these composers' works were banned from the Soviet Union. The musical complexities of these works were considered inaccessible to the proletariat, and hence bourgeois. Let's take a listen to Shostakovich's Symphony No. 5. Note the ambiguous tonalities, the complex voicing, and dissonant harmonies of the piece, all of which were also present in Prokofiev's Piano Sonata No. 6. Such elements were considered too complex and inaccessible to constitute proletarian music, and the RAPM demanded that these composers write music that would be more accessible to the proletariat and less entangled in bourgeois formalism. The advent of socialist realism and the implementation of the Zhdanov doctrine in the anti-formalist campaign are both reflections of the Marxist ideology upon which the Soviet Union was founded. The principle that the morally good working classes must inevitably overthrow the capitalist order of the exploiter classes inspired the revolution of 1917, in which the Russian economy fell into the hands of the proletariat. However, during the Stalin regime and under the policies of Andrei Zhdanov, this ideology expanded to the cultural sphere, which likewise fell into the hands of the working classes. Socialist realism was accessible, socialized art for the people. The anti-formalist campaign represented a continued overthrow of bourgeois culture through the banning of music that was inaccessible to the masses. We see here that in order to maintain a Russia dominated by the proletariat and the party, the regime made the culture of the Soviet Union to reflect its political and economic principles, demonstrating the kind of authoritarianism that was rampant throughout the Stalin era and would only end with the advent of Nikita Khrushchev's thaw following Stalin's death.